Half-Life 2 is often regarded as one of the greatest games of all time. Personally, it's one of my most favorite games as well. But when playing it today, it's hard to see what makes it so special. I mean, it's just another first-person shooter, right? Well, not exactly. It's one of the best games of all time for a reason. I've noticed that as a newer generation comes up into the world of video games, they often have trouble understanding what makes Half-Life 2 so great, and why it's so highly regarded. So I figured I'd do my best to help explain what makes Half-Life 2 one of the best games of all time. Starting off with what you should always start off with when talking about older games is the context in which Half-Life 2 came out. Half-Life 2 is a sequel to the very highly regarded Half-Life 1. Now, Half-Life 1 could take up its own video as to why it was such a significant release, and why it is also regarded as one of the best games ever. But to keep this video from being 2 hours long, I'll just say that at the time, Half-Life 1 was groundbreaking. Before Half-Life 1's release, first-person shooters had primarily focused on the mechanics and the gameplay side of things, without paying much attention to anything else. Shooters were fast-paced and didn't pay a second thought to anything other than who or what you were shooting. So when Half-Life 1 released with this heavy focus on world-building and telling a story through its playtime, it was seen as a masterpiece. When it was announced that a sequel was coming out to one of the best games ever made, expectations were high. Now, let's go back to 2003. The PS2 was selling gangbusters, and the baby-faced newcomer known as the Xbox was picking up pace in the market. The personal computer was struggling to make a dent, and it desperately needed a killer release. Most games at the time were fairly basic. Things were bolted down into place, and you'd often look to pre-rendered cutscenes for truly standout moments. Look at Final Fantasy X for no better example of the style games were trying to emulate. Linear hallways connecting one story beat to another, with a heavy emphasis on characters and telling an engrossing story. There's nothing wrong with the style, but it was the mold that most followed around this time. One of the first big shakeups of this era was Grand Theft Auto 3, which allowed players to roam around an open world at their own discretion, without being limited to linear series of hallways connected to one another. Even still, GTA 3 was fairly simple, and even the follow-up in Vice City was still quite basic from a technical standpoint. Games were doing well, but with newer and better technology around the corner, consumers felt as if more could be done. Everything felt rigid and inorganic. Geometry was harsh and sheer, objects were nailed down to the environment, it just felt like one huge set piece. Organic design was a foreign concept and games felt closed in and capped off on potential. Not only that, but genuinely new and interesting concepts popped up less and less as time went on. Look no further for a more creatively bankrupt genre than the first-person shooter. Shelves were flooded with World War II shooters as far as the eye could see. Consumers were convinced that nothing would ever shake the industry up as much as the shooters of yore did. But then, in mid-May amidst the 9th annual Electronic Entertainment Expo, one game stood out amongst thousands and dropped jaws across the world. Half-Life 2's first ever gameplay demonstration was shown, and, needless to say, it left an impression. The long-awaited sequel to Half-Life 1 was finally here, and it was mind-blowing. The newly conceived Source engine showed off insanely realistic physics and remarkable graphics for the time. The demo also showcased huge open areas that seemed almost endless, and incredible effects that had never been seen before. The footage was legitimately unbelievable. The hype train for Half-Life 2 fired at full speed from that point on, and the masses could not wait until it dropped. Finally, after an unfortunate delay due to the game's source code being leaked, Half-Life 2 was released to the public in November of 2004. Keeping all of that in mind, let's now dive into the game itself. For this section, I'd like to compare Half-Life 2 to similar games that came out around the same time. Deus Ex Invisible War and Halo 2 are good comparisons because they share a lot of aspects with Half-Life 2, and do well in showing how ahead of the curve Half-Life 2 was for its time. Now, Half-Life 2 is known for a lot of things, but it's probably most well known for the engine it was developed on, the Source engine. As I previously mentioned, most games at the time were very rigid in a literal sense. Everything was put in a certain spot and couldn't be moved from its original location. Even the few games that had physics engines were very basic. A couple of objects could be moved around, but it never felt natural. So the concept of being able to move any object you see in the world around and for it to behave as one would expect was, and still is, pretty amazing. Let's look at Deus Ex and compare. Sure, both games have a physics engine, but everything in Deus Ex feels stiff and as if objects are all made out of plastic. Even the glass objects that can break don't feel quite right. For instance, instead of throwing what is supposed to be a ceramic plate at a wall, which then shatters, it feels like you're throwing a plastic plate at a wall, which then transforms into smaller plastic bits. Then when you make it out to the overworld, almost all interactable objects vanish, and we're back to the bolt objects down way of design. So for Half-Life 2 to fill its entire world with interactive and movable objects was seriously impressive stuff. It wasn't just being able to move things around though, it was the game's ability to convey objects' weight to you just through interacting with them. People often make fun of the seesaw puzzle that Half-Life 2 likes to make so much use of, but that was damn cool when you first saw it in 2004. Objects reacting to gravity is one thing, but everything having a realistic weight and interacting with different things in different ways was astounding. For instance, if you place a hollow barrel into a body of water, it'll float, but place a cinder block into the water and it sinks right down to the bottom as it would in real life. Objects in Half-Life 2 felt how you would expect them to feel. Everything moved in a way that felt natural, and it was amazing how every interaction felt as if you weren't playing a game, but instead moving real items in a real world. Again, this may not seem like revolutionary stuff nowadays, but back then it was truly incredible. The technical amazement of the physics wasn't the only thing that was incredible about them though. The way Valve justified this engine by naturally fitting the physics into the gameplay was quite impressive. Numerous times throughout the game you'll be put into scenarios where you need to utilize the physics to complete a section. Going back to the barrels floating on water, there's a specific segment where you're trapped in a small pool of water with enemies trying to kill you. In this particular instance, they drop explosive barrels onto you from above, and then finally they toss in one barrel that's on fire and about to explode. However, all of these barrels are floating on the surface, as they would in real life, so in order to avoid dying you have to dive under the surface to avoid the explosions from above. It may be a small segment of the game that starts and stops in under a minute, but it was an incredibly intelligent way to showcase the engine's ability to render realistic buoyancy while working it into a natural gameplay section. Half-Life 2 is filled with these moments and prevented the game from just devolving into a tech demo. This is without even getting into the gravity gun, by the way, which is still one of the most innovative and creative weapons ever implemented into a video game. The section after you acquire the gravity gun also shows off Valve's knack for working technical amazement into natural, fluid gameplay sections. At no point in Ravenholm or any point past do you feel as if you're being led along some showcase of the Source engine. Instead, you're just working your way through a forgotten town with a newly acquired weapon. Half-Life 2 was also a downright beautiful game. Back in 2004, the extent of truly incredible graphics was very limited. Pre-rendered cutscenes were the go-to if you wanted to really wow your player base. So for a game to come out and maintain that same level of beauty and detail in a real-time environment was jaw-dropping. Textures were sharp and detailed, environments were sprawling and littered with tons of interactable objects, and the dynamic lighting felt soft and natural. Other games at the time could only dream to be as visually stunning as Half-Life 2 was. Just look at Halo 2, a game that came out a week before Half-Life. In Halo 2, textures are muddy and the landscape feels jagged and rough. Everything looks and feels like it's made out of plastic. Environments are basic and the lighting is harsh. It just cannot stand up to the visual fidelity of Half-Life 2. But what's really astounding is that, at the time, Halo 2 was not considered an ugly game. So for Half-Life 2 to come out 1 week later and blow what were considered to be visually impressive games out of the water was insane. Half-Life 2 also makes use of some incredible facial animations as well. Now, a lot of things Half-Life 2 does had been done before, but these facial animations were revolutionary. NPCs would have flawless lip syncing in real-time environments and would be able to convey emotions accurately through just their facial expressions. Look at what games of this era were doing in regards to facial animation. In Deus Ex Invisible War, faces are stone cold without a single hint of emotion in them. The eyes are unmoving and the characters as a whole feel lifeless. In Half-Life 2, characters emote, they look around, they blink, they smile, they frown, and most importantly of all, they animate in a way that feels human. This was truly something special at the time. Even if it seems incredibly minor now, it was a big deal in moving forward towards making video game characters feel that much more alive. Technical amazement isn't all Half-Life 2 is about though. The artistic side is also staggering. Half-Life 2 sets up such an oppressive, bleak tone through just visuals alone. The first thing you see coming out of the train in the beginning of the game is a drone hovering over to immediately begin monitoring you, while a 10-foot screen with what you can only assume is your leader meanders on and on about how great the place you just arrived at is. Couple this with the trash littered everywhere and the walls that are ridden with graffiti and rebel posters, and you've already gotten to learn everything you need to know about this world just by taking your first few steps into it. This oppressive tone is continually hammered home as you progress more and more through the game. Apartment complexes are in disarray, people are being beaten in plain view, and corpses are scattered everywhere. the world of Half-Life 2 weighs down on you and gives you reason to keep pressing forward. And what would a game be without some solid writing? Now, the writing in Half-Life 2 wasn't exactly groundbreaking, but for a video game it offered some seriously impressive stuff. Most characters are written very well and show off their individual personalities in a way that feels natural and human. Barney is a wisecracking buddy doing his best to help the effort. Alex is a strong, intelligent companion who feels the need to earn her keep throughout your journey together, and Kleiner's a paranoid worrywart who just wants things back to the way they were. None of these traits are ever outright told to you, but instead they're what you pick up off of each character's dialogue. As for the plot, it's very basic but offers up a solid reason for the game to exist. Every twist and turn feels valid and understandable. Instead of just teleporting to the next level, you have an actual reason to be pressing on into Ravenholm or Nova Prospect. If you're looking for a real showcase of the writing talent over at Valve though, then look no further than Dr. Brane's monologues. Some of his individual lines were almost haunting, and his speeches as a whole honestly give pause for thought.
Tell me, Dr. Freeman, if you can. You have destroyed so much. What is it exactly that you have created? Can you name even one thing? I thought not.
It takes a lot for a game to make you stop in your tracks and actually think through what you're doing. Ultimately, you really have no choice but to press on, but even worming the thought of the player character being in the wrong into your head is some impressive stuff. The writing overall in Half-Life 2 was something that had obvious care and effort put into it, and it reflected in its effectiveness throughout the game. One of the most underappreciated aspects of this game, though, is its stellar world building. The world of Half-Life 2 feels alive and breathing, and every corner you turn has another little moment or scene to help drive home its authenticity. In fact, the chapter point insertion is a masterclass in establishing a believable world with tact and grace. Instead of being dumped into an hour-long exposition session, you're left to wander around on your own. This lets you take in the world at your own pace and observe what's going on without it feeling forced upon you. This helps every scripted sequence feel natural, as if it's just another day for these people and you happen to stumble in unannounced. The world of Half-Life 2 feels like it existed long before you stepped foot in it, and you're only here for a tour. Another aspect of the world that I appreciated was its sense of scale. Half-Life 2 does not have an open world. It's as linear as any other game I've mentioned in this video. But there's a difference between a game that is linear and a game that feels linear. Half-Life 2 is a linear game that does not feel linear. The expansiveness of some of the areas you're in make it feel as if you're traversing through a world and not a series of hallways. Take for instance Highway 17. This entire chapter is essentially one giant road you drive down to get to Nova Prospect. But there are so many nooks and crannies to explore off the beaten path that it hardly feels like you're being led along a track to reach the next objective. When you stop the car, get out, and spend 20 minutes exploring some house that you easily could have just driven past, then all of a sudden, it no longer feels like you're heading straight down this hallway to the next story beat, but instead that you're driving along Highway 17 on your way to Nova Prospect. The entirety of Half-Life 2 follows this design philosophy of every chapter offering multiple areas that are slightly out of the way that help round out the world you're in and make it feel that much more believable. It's not just the optional areas though. It's also the way that Valve managed to make even the necessary areas feel open-ended and expansive. This time, let's take a look at the chapter Water Hazard, which has the same basic premise as Highway 17 and the same amount of linearity. One thing both of these chapters do well is the way they switch up the path you're on. Instead of being required to stay in your boat or your car the entire way through, you have to get out numerous times and explore these large facilities that are on the way. Again, you're still on the track that was laid out for you by the developers, but it feels to the player as if they're branching off from the main path and undergoing a secondary objective. This simple tactic helped expand a linear game into a far more expansive and open-ended experience. I could continue to go on and on about this game, but I feel like at this point it's probably reasonable to see why Half-Life 2 is so beloved by so many people. It brought about an overall level of quality that video games had just never seen before. Every aspect of this game was polished to a sheen, and even today, there haven't been very many games to match Half-Life 2's level of excellence. It's understandable to play through Half-Life 2 today and not be blown away by it, as many games have gone above and beyond what it accomplished. But, if there's one thing that I'd want someone to take away from all of this, it's that context is important when playing old games. Jumping from other games of that era into Half-Life 2 was such a sheer, drastic increase in quality that it's easily apparent why this game has earned such a legendary status. For it to come out when it did and be as good as it was genuinely astounding, and no game since has set the bar so high for its time. That is what makes Half-Life 2 so good.
Come on, Gordon. We've got to get out of here. Maybe we still have...
Time, Dr. Freeman? Is it really that time again?